Welcome to Hestia's Muse, where we tend to the sacred fires of the heart, exploring spiritual principles woven into the fabric of astrology, tarot, and the wheel of the year. Have you ever found comfort in the cycles of the moon, or sought guidance in the symbolism of tarot cards? I'm Liliana Blackstar, and I will be your guide in this journey of self-discovery. Join me in this space where the study of astrology becomes an act of self-care and a pathway to self-actualization. We are here for another episode of my podcast, Hestia's Muse, Astrology and Tarot Devotionals. And it is Gemini season, so we're going to start talking about the Gemini tarot cards, starting with the Eight of Swords. But I wanted to switch things up for Gemini season. So I invited a guest to my podcast. I have here my friend Lillia, and Lillia is a very great tarot card reader. I think you're a very fantastic tarot card reader. And we've been friends since 2018. And I'm just excited to bring a little bit of a different vibe to the podcast by bringing a guest on and talking to you about this tarot card and this placement. So go ahead and tell us a little about yourself, Lillia.
Hello everyone, my name is Lillia. I read tarot cards and have since 2011, although my interest in divination stems to childhood, but we'll skip that part. But I've been reading tarot since 2011, and I've picked up some astrology bits here and there since meeting Liliana in 2018. So it's been really fascinating getting to know the tarot through the lens of astrology a lot better.
Yes, and I am excited because one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on with this specific episode is because we're going to talk about some Gemini energy and specifically the planet Jupiter in the sign of Gemini, which has just started. Jupiter entered the sign of Gemini on May 25th of this year. And you have Jupiter in Gemini in your birth chart, correct?
Yes, natally, I am a Jupiter and Gemini. My other big three placements, I guess you could say, are a Leo Sun, Gemini Moon conjunct the Jupiter and Gemini, and then
Mm-hmm.
a Leo rising.
Yeah, so you're a Gemini moon, so I think that'll be perfect for talking about some of the Gemini stuff, especially since your Gemini moon is conjunct with Jupiter in your birth chart. And we just happen to have the timing of this talk really coincide with Jupiter entering Gemini while the sun is in the first decan of Gemini. And the first decan, the first 10 degrees of Gemini are sub-ruled by Jupiter. So we have both the sun and Jupiter currently in the decan that is ruled by Jupiter. So the way that I do this podcast, for anyone that's just joining us for the first time, is I like to take a look at a minor arcana tarot card from the perspective of the decan that it is related to in astrology. So a decan is a subdivision of a sign. Each sign is divided into 3 sections, a middle, a beginning, and an end, and those are 10 degrees each. So the first decan of Gemini begins with 0 degrees Gemini, and it goes through the end of the 9th degree of Gemini. And while the entire sign of Gemini is ruled by Mercury, the decans are like sub-ruled by planets, so you can think of that as like a shift manager. So Mercury is still the boss of the entire sign of Gemini, but each of the 10 degrees sections has a sub-ruler. It's like a shift manager of that specific section of Gemini. So the first 10 degrees of Gemini is sub-ruled by Jupiter. And so the timing of Jupiter entering Gemini at the same time that the sun is in this first decan of Gemini is just really exciting because we get to talk about the tarot card of that decan at the same time that we get to talk about the planetary combination of Jupiter and Gemini and the card that represents that signature.
I'm so excited.
So I usually like to start out by just doing a little bit of a breakdown of the sign energy. So let's just look at some Gemini basics first. Do you have insight as a Gemini moon to just kind of how you would describe the archetype of Gemini?
Gemini is a very chatty, vibrant, easily bored sign. Um, the way I experience Gemini energy is I have like this constant seeking for novelty. I love newness and freshness, and I do find myself getting bored very easily. I'm also very logical in my emotions, so I like to rationalize every little emotion that I have, and then as well as I like to talk and I like to think. I like to think. I spend a lot of time in contemplation.
Yes. Yes, so Gemini is an air sign, and so the element of air is very related to our thoughts and how we think about things and how we learn and how we communicate. So it's a very, all of the air signs are very social, and all of the air signs tend towards being an intellectual or liking to break things down and understand them. And so I like to describe Gemini. I think one of the best keywords for Gemini is curiosity. And
Yes, I'm
so,
a very curious person.
because yes, Gemini wants to know why. Like, how is this working? What is that? What, how does this work? What are all of the pieces? Like, Gemini is the archetype of the part of all of us that wants to know why. Just and to understand what's going on in the world around us, we have to be able to ask questions and answer questions and have basic language communication skills, because that's how we understand the world around us. Like, part of our understanding the world around us is through, seeing things and touching things and smelling things. But then the next part is like asking the questions, because you don't want to just taste the thing. You want to ask someone, is this poisonous? Can I eat this? Is it good for me? What does it taste like? Before you actually like ingest it, right?
Yes, you must get to know the thing before you do the thing.
Yes. So, um, Gemini has just this very curious nature, and that curiosity comes through in asking questions, being social, being excited to learn things and interact with people, and also share what you think about things, because that's part of the joy of it. Is I don't want to just hear what people have to say, but I want to also be able to share what I have to say. And so that's how we start to get into the duality of Gemini too, because communication is a two-way street. There's listening and there's speaking. So we have both sides of this duality of communication. In order to learn something, we have to ask the question and then we have to receive the answer. And we have to have someone give the information and they got it from someone else. So there's this duality and this giving and receiving, give and take balance with Gemini. And that's why Gemini is represented by the symbols of the twins. There's this complexity of human nature and the interplay of contrasting forces within us. So we have the power of communication and the exchange of ideas that we can't necessarily do by ourselves. But also there's this duality of like needing to change and be flexible and be complex as an individual. I was thinking today about the way that I communicate with my friends is different than the way that I communicate with my romantic partner, and it's different than the way that I communicate with my children, right? Like, we change ourselves to appropriately communicate in different modalities and different environments.
I agree.
And that is part of the Gemini nature. And, just to reiterate, when I'm talking about Gemini, I'm not only talking about people with Gemini sun or Gemini moon. We all have these traits within us to some degree or another, regardless of what you have in your birth chart. Regardless of when you were born, we all have like all of the signs kind of collectively show us a different parts of basic human nature, right? And so when I'm
Yeah.
talking about the archetype of Gemini, everyone has this archetype of Gemini within them and the capability to flex and change how they communicate, how they behave. You can be curious about different things and get excited about communication and sharing your ideas with others.
Yeah. So as an example, Jupiter, Gemini rules my 11th house. Where does Gemini live for you, Liliana?
Gemini in my chart rules my fifth house.
Ooh. Okay.
Um, so that's kind of fun. That's like creativity. So fifth house is creativity. So I think that that's why my creativity comes across in the realm of writing and speaking. I don't
I
make
definitely
visual
see that
art.
for
I
you.
make I make art with words and intellection, like my speaking.
I love that.
Yes. So the duality of Gemini and the curiosity of Gemini I think are the most important concepts to remember. It's very flexible. As an air element sign, the element of air represents our minds, our thoughts, and our ideas. It's the realm of knowledge and imagination. Everything that we do first begins as a thought or an idea, right?
Yes.
And then we act on it. So, or we choose whether or not to act on it. Even the act of like manifesting something, it starts first with us like conjuring the idea, imagining and visualizing the thing that we want to manifest. So we bring in this air sign energy, and the air signs of the zodiac are Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. And these three signs all correspond with different aspects of our mind. And they are, to some degree, the signs of intellect and objectivity, innovation, imagination, thoughtfulness, communication, being social, being curious, and being adaptive. Like all the air signs have to adapt because with our minds, with our thoughts, we have to be able to quickly change our mind about things based on new information that we receive. Or
Yes.
asking new questions based on, oh, we received new information and I need to understand it better. So I have to quickly adapt. And so adaptability and changeability is a trait of all of the air signs. So we're going to eventually connect this back to the tarot, and to start with, just to know that in the tarot, the suit of swords is the element of air. And so when you look at any of the cards that have the swords on them, these are representations of the element of air, the process of thinking, communicating, being innovative, being adaptive, being thoughtful, being curious.
Making
I like to think of it
decisions.
as like having a sharp mind,
Yeah.
or the way that people say that people can have a sharp tongue, or that the tongue is a weapon, like a sword, like because you can hurt people with your words just the way that you can cut someone with a knife, right? So that's how I like to
Absolutely.
remember that the suit of swords is associated with the element of air. It's about the power of my words and the power of my mind, and like cutting through information to get to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So Gemini is also a mutable sign, and the mutable signs relate to the process of change. In the seasonal wheel of the year, the mutable signs come at the end of a season. So we are in the northern hemisphere at the end of spring. The end of spring is Gemini season, and it's changing into summer. So it's starting to have that thing where some days are very spring-like, but some days are very summer-like, and we're like, has summer already started? Or has it not? Astrologically, it's still spring, but the weather is starting to behave like it's already summer in some cases. And then it starts to act like spring again. So it's very like back and forth, right? And that's kind of a reputation of these mutable signs, is having this kind of back and forth changing energy. They're really hard to nail down and define.
They
And the
evolve and
mutable signs,
permutate.
yeah, the mutable signs are Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
And so the energy of mutable signs is about something that's dynamic, and that means it's not holding still, it's in the process of changing. And so it's dynamic, adaptable, versatile, flexible, fluid, mutable, right?
Their emotion.
Yes, they're in motion, they're in flux. So it's very hard to define these signs, especially mutable air. It's like, okay, air is not something that we even think of as solid in the first place. And air in with this is like, it's mutable air. So it's air that's in the process of changing. It's changing speed, it's changing temperature. It's starts as one kind of wind and then turns into a different kind of wind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's kind of like, I can see it, feel it physically day to day with the spring weather, the end of spring weather, right? Because like it starts out in the morning, it's like there's moisture in the air. It was raining this morning, and then the sun came out and it got kind of hot and humid. And then later in the day, it's kind of dry. And I'm like, the quality of the air just changed so many times throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know if I needed to wear a sweater or not, because it's like it's cold and then it's warm and then it's cold again. What's going on? It's Gemini season. It's mutable.
Yeah.
And so we get these mutable signs at the end of every season. And by definition, they kind of contain contradictions. The mutable signs defy definition and contain contradictions, which is why people get so confused by Geminis, because you have this air sign that's constantly changing. And if you've been around someone with a lot of Gemini energy, their energy changes so quickly from one moment to the next, right? We don't know what to expect. Which person is going to show up at the party? Is it
Expect
right?
the unexpected.
Right. It is a very expect the unexpected energy with Gemini, because that mutable air is constantly fluxing. And if we remember that it's the air sign, so it's about that curiosity and flexible fluid um, that flexible fluid mutable energy is being brought to the realm of intellect and socializing and thoughts and ideas and curiosity, then it's like we can start to get this picture of the mind is constantly active and the mind is also constantly changing.
Yes.
So so the ability to change our mind is a Gemini trait. Whether we have Gemini in our chart or not, if you've ever had your mind changed about something, you've participated in the archetype of Gemini, right? If you've ever
Yeah.
been curious about something and said, that's interesting. I wonder if that's true. Or I wonder how that works. Or I wonder what are the little pieces and parts inside of this thing that make it work. Then you've been participating in Gemini energy, right?
Absolutely.
And again, tying it back to the tarot, the mutable signs of the minor arcana tarot, the mutable signs are represented by the end of the suit, just like the end of the season. So it's the 8, the 9, and the 10 of the respective suit. And that's how we
Man.
get to the Gemini tarot cards of the major arcana, since Gemini is
Hmm.
air and air is swords. And Gemini is mutable, and mutable is the 8, 9, and 10. Then we have the 8, 9, and 10 of swords are your Gemini cards.
The 8, 9, and 10 of swords are pretty heavy, heavy
They
cards.
are.
They're
Those
very
cards are
weighty,
some of the
rough
like
cards.
you pull those cards and you cringe, you go, oh, ouch. And then it makes sense with this context, though, of like, you know how on social media, when people are sharing memes about a sign, like Gemini gets dogged on all the time. People
Yeah,
love to
they
hate on Gemini.
do.
Well, look at the imagery of the tarot cards that are associated with this. Is not fun.
It's not pleasant. Which is
It's not
interesting
pleasant. And
because
we're
like
not saying,
they're curious and
mhm,
intellectual, and yet those thoughts are like the swords, and they can have the potential to hurt us.
right? So we're again, I'm not saying that like all of the people with Gemini placements are big downers, but the archetype itself has some very complex traits that are maybe difficult to cope with and deal with on a day-to-day basis. So when we get to the looking at Gemini energy, we go, okay, there's these 3 sections of Gemini, the 3 decans. So we divide it into sections that are 10 degrees each. We'd have the first 10 degrees of of Gemini, and that's the 8 of Swords, and that's the card that we're going to talk about more in detail as we move forward. Each decan, so each of those 10-degree sections of Gemini, as I said, are sub-ruled by a planet. So all of this is very mercurial. We have Mercury energy in all of these cards. But there's also a sub-ruler, so there's that shift manager energy. So each decan is sub-ruled by a planet, and in this case, it is Gemini. So when we look at the tarot card, the 8 of Swords, we can go, okay, it relates to the first 10 degrees of Gemini, which is sub-ruled by Jupiter, or we can look at it and say, this is the card of Jupiter in Gemini. And
And
it doesn't
Jupiter
have
in
to be
Gemini is a
limited.
detriment place.
Yes, yes. So it doesn't have to be limited to this card only means Jupiter in Gemini, but we can recognize that when any planet is in these first 10 degrees of Gemini, it's going to have a Jupiter influence on it. And to understand this card a little better, we can really look into the essence of Jupiter to help us break down, why is this card a Jupiter in Gemini card? Why is this card a card of both Jupiter archetype and Gemini archetype? We already understand pretty well why it's a Gemini archetype. But why is it specifically Jupiter in Gemini? And so we'll shift now to talk a little bit about um, Jupiter. Jupiter. But first of all, I'm curious, what are the first key words or key concepts that come into your mind when you think of the Eight of Swords tarot card?
Restriction, feeling stuck, feeling limited.
Yeah. So just for people that might not be able to just picture a tarot card in your head right away.
So I have
So
the
the Eight of Swords in traditional cards is going to be in traditional Rider-Waite Smith tarot. This is the one where there is a figure that is tied up and blindfolded, and they're standing next to eight swords stabbed into the ground. Their feet are not bound, but their body is bound. They're tied up, but they could walk away. But they're blindfolded, so they're not exactly able to see where they're going if they start to walk away. So yes, some of the keywords for that Eight of Swords tarot card are uncertainty, helplessness, fear, isolation, limitation, restriction, as well as remembering that the swords are about your thoughts and your ideas. So this is about negative thinking, mental entrapment, self-imposed barriers,
self-limiting beliefs.
having a victim mentality is another one with this card. Like, it's not necessarily that you are a victim, but when you're feeling like a victim and you're telling yourself you're a victim, and that feeling of, I can't do anything to help myself, even if maybe you can, you just can't see it right now.
Yeah.
So we're going to get back to some of that, but first I want to talk about Jupiter, just in general for a minute, because Jupiter is, it's a lot. It's a lot to understand. So first of all, it's the largest planet in our solar system, and in astrology, Jupiter symbolizes expansion, abundance, and the principle of growth. It is often referred to as the great benefic, and a benefic in astrology relates to a planet that is giving gifts or it's bringing some kind of blessing.
Hmm.
And Jupiter exudes an optimistic and generous energy. It rules over the higher mind. So while Mercury is like just your day-to-day thoughts, Jupiter is when you're having those really deep thoughts, right?
Yes.
And so it rules over the higher mind, like philosophy and religion and beliefs, as well as our ideas about ethics and morality.
I just had a
So,
thought.
ooh,
So Gemini's very curious, Jupiter's very expansive. Gemini's always asking why, and Jupiter is more higher knowledge. It's like the existential placement of Jupiter. Like, why do
yes.
I exist?
Yes, 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 because that's where it's really going to take us with Jupiter and Gemini, is Gemini wants to know, like, why about everything, and Jupiter wants to know, like, what it means. Like, what does it all mean, right? And so, like, it's going to get very existential with Jupiter and Gemini. So, Jupiter's about figuring out like what you believe in and seeking wisdom and seeking like a broader, deeper understanding of life. Jupiter is concerned with like the capital T truth. Like Whereas Mercury or Gemini might just be like, how does this machine work? Um, Jupiter might be asking the questions like, is it ethical to use this machine? How is it right to use this machine? You know?
Mm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
it kind of starts to get like a little beyond just what the function of the machine is. And so we're having these conversations already with AI. Like AI exists and Jupiter and Gemini is going to have us going, should it exist? Is it ethical for us to use it? What are the long-term like social implications of using this technology beyond just like how it functions and how it works and what it can be used for, which is kind of more of the Mercury or Gemini side of things. So that's one example. Um, so it's like it's this seeking this broader understanding and this deeper understanding of life. So Jupiter can be associated with luck and opportunities and like abundance. It inspires us to reach for higher goals and embrace a more expansive view of the world. So in the astrological chart, Jupiter's placement is often seen as a source of enthusiasm and optimism and a desire for a meaningful experience. Jupiter encourages a spirit of exploration, both intellectually and experientially. So we don't want to just think about it, but we want to experience life with Jupiter, right?
We want to
And then
learn and travel.
yes, so that's why like Jupiter rules over the sign of Sagittarius, which is like, let's go to college and let's travel and get a broader world perspective and have adventures that teach us things because there's things that we can only learn from experiencing them rather than book learning. And so Jupiter is more about like the I want to learn things through experience and from talking to other people that I can't just learn by going to my local library and reading a book or watching a documentary, but I need to like actually go there and talk to the people myself. And it's why like, you know, you go to college, you move out of your hometown and you suddenly start meeting people that are coming from a different background than you. You meet people from different cultures, you meet people with different backgrounds, and it broadens your perspective because you realize that the way things are in your hometown is not the way things are everywhere in the world, right? And so that's that
Yeah.
broadening perspective of Jupiter is like get out there, experience life, adventure, and talk to other people. And then you start to get a bigger perspective and you start to understand that it's not just about me and my hometown and the family unit that I grew up with, but there's a lot of other perspectives out there in the world. And so then we start to really be able to get into with this broader perspective, um, narrowing down what we believe in about life, because Jupiter relates to our beliefs. And so if we go out and experience the world and get a broader perspective, that changes our beliefs. That changes what we believe about the world, like our worldview. And
Mm-hmm.
then from there, we start to develop a philosophy on life, a personal philosophy, a religious or spiritual philosophy, and a personal sense of ethics and morals. Because Jupiter is asking not just like, how does this work? But it's going, should it work? Is it good? Is it, um, is it
Is
right
it
or wrong?
just?
Is it just?
Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is why I think when we start to see this Jupiter in Gemini, we go, oh, that all of that curiosity of Gemini asking why, what does it mean? What does it mean? How does it work? Jupiter can get all caught in the weeds with this type of
Yeah.
thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because we have this aspiration to explore the boundless possibilities that the universe has to offer, and that's Jupiter. And then we have Jupiter, which can get, Gemini, I mean, which can get really caught up in the details and the, well, what about this? And what about this? And don't forget about that. And what's over here? And oh, look, a squirrel.
Squirrel.
Squirrel!
Did you say squirrel?
So, Jupiter in Gemini is considered to be in detriment. So, when a planet is in the opposite sign of its home, so we talked about Jupiter rules Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is the opposite sign from Gemini. So, when a planet is in this sign that is opposite from its home, it is considered to be in detriment. And another way of understanding detriment is just thinking of if you were to travel to a foreign country, you are suddenly at a disadvantage because you aren't familiar with the customs, you don't know the language, there's a language barrier. Suddenly, just going to the grocery store and buying what you need for dinner is much more complicated.
Yeah.
And so Jupiter does not necessarily become malefic. Jupiter is still a benefic planet. It still gives blessings. But when it's in detriment, it's like it's just having to navigate some red tape or some weird bureaucracy in order to give us the blessings. Like it's a dignitary that's visiting from another country and it wants to give us a blessing, but we don't speak that language. Like the Gemini is like a totally different language. Gemini is moving really fast and paying attention to the details and looking at the small little details of everything. And Jupiter's trying to teach us how to look at the big picture. But it's just like it just has difficulty. Jupiter just has less ease in expressing itself in the sign of Gemini.
Jupiter has myopia or
Yes,
short-sightedness
like
in Gemini.
it's like there's the saying about like I can't see the forest through the trees, but this is like the opposite problem of being able to see all of the trees and the whole forest all at once. But
Overwhelming.
knowing that like each tree has an individual problem that needs to be solved, and like the Gemini energy is going, what about this? What about this? What about this? Over here, over here, over here. And Jupiter's like, information overload, too many problems to solve. I can't solve all of the, like, I can't. And there we have that image of the Eight of Swords. Like, all of those
Ah,
swords are like problems, and which one should I focus on? Which one do I solve first? Which problem do I listen to? Which thing do I pay attention to?
yeah.
And it's like you tie yourself up in this in your own mind, in your own thoughts, in your own ideas of what like there's like a concept of decision paralysis.
I was just thinking that phrase. I was like, man, this sounds exactly like decision paralysis,
Yes, when you
an
have
extension
too
of
many
decision
decisions
fatigue.
to make or too many choices, and so you can't decide.
It's like the Seven of Cups sister almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that there's also like water on the ground in this card in the traditional imagery. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like a full flowing river, but it's like puddles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Jupiter is exalted in Cancer.
Which is right after Gemini.
Right. So it's like the the difficulty that it has in Gemini is resolved by compassion. The compassion of Cancer is something that like Jupiter is really good at and actually benefits from tuning into this like compassionate, watery energy. And it's almost like the air energy is just spreading it too thin. It's drying itself out. It's like when I try to do too many things at once and spread myself thin or have too many irons in the fire, you know, and then I get
Oh,
overwhelmed and then I can't do anything.
oh, I know that feeling all too well. All too well.
Yeah, so it's like I don't want to say that the entirety of Jupiter and Gemini is going to be this overwhelming, but I think that it's something that we need to be aware of because Jupiter is going to be in Gemini for the next year. It doesn't leave until like May 9th of 2025 when it goes into
Whew.
Cancer. So it's all the way until next May, and there's really a potential for us during this year of Jupiter and Gemini to very much get bogged down with decision
Mm-hmm.
paralysis or information overload.
Yeah.
Um, it's like when we're constantly on social media receiving new bits of information all day, but we're not giving ourselves the time to truly process that information
Mm-hmm.
before we're being given new information and more information and more and more and more. It just keeps coming and keeps coming. And then we end up being bound and tied up and feeling helpless like the Eight of Swords.
Yeah.
So the Eight of Swords card is showing us, it's warning us like there's potential for, since Jupiter takes everything and expands it, and it's expanding the intellectual curiosity and thirst for knowledge of Gemini, there's a very real possibility of just information overload, decision paralysis, overwhelm, too much going on to where you just feel like helpless, like I can't do anything. So why should I do anything at all? Like we get this like compassion fatigue when we think about activism or how we want to help change the world, right?
There's
Um,
so many things that out there
so
that
many
need
things like
solving.
I want to be like staying up to date on what's happening in Palestine, but I also need to be staying up to date and aware of like what's happening with um trans youth here in America and what's happening with abortion rights and what's happening with the upcoming election. Like this Jupiter and Gemini is going to be going on through the United States election. Oh my gosh, like we're just like it's
Rough.
too much. We can't decide which thing do we put our energy on. Where do we put our action? Where do we put our words? Right? Because there's so much going on.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's really important throughout this year to remember to like decompress, to take regular like social media breaks, even if they're just short ones, like a day at a time, a week at a time, just to give yourself time to process all of the information you are receiving. Because we're in this time period where we're really like in a state of constant information overload because of social media. And
Mm-hmm.
like always have like there's TV, there's radio, there's podcasts to listen to,
There's
there's so much
podcasts
information.
to
It's
make.
like, yeah, podcasts to make, things to write. It's just a lot. So I think it's going to be really important for us to remember that while we're going through this, like Jupiter has some really great things to teach us in Gemini, but we won't be able to make sense of it if we don't like cut ourselves off from the
Oh
constant
yeah.
input um, and kind of force ourselves to process all of that information. So I'm just looking at my notes because I had a lot of stuff that I wrote down about Jupiter and Gemini because I've been thinking about it all week and just really like meditating on this energy and this card and just like so much just keeps coming up. Um, so when we're talking about like Jupiter expanding whatever it touches, and Gemini being like this curiosity, this so we have this like growing compulsion to explore diverse subjects and philosophies and belief systems. So on one hand, we might get really like inspired to think about deep, diverse things and philosophies and our beliefs, right? And to broaden our
Mm-hmm.
understanding of the world. However,
Yeah.
this can also tend towards a scattering of energy or a superficiality because you're spreading yourself too thin and only able to learn a little bit on the surface, and not actually going as deep as you think that you are. Because it's like blowing up a balloon. Like the bigger you blow the balloon, um, the like more thin that layer of latex gets, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's not actually very strong when it's very big. So bigger does not necessarily mean stronger. So there's like a spreading yourself too thin or a scattering of energy or a distortion that takes place. So what seems like the truth might not actually be the truth because it's been being distorted by the way that Jupiter expands it and makes it bigger. Because again,
Mm.
thinking about that balloon, if you draw a picture on a balloon when it's not blown up and then you blow it up, that picture gets distorted.
Yeah.
And so there's a possibility of like, while we go seeking for this deeper existential truth while Jupiter's in Gemini, we can also fall prey to we're receiving a distorted version of the truth, or we're only receiving like a surface level part of the truth, but not the deeper level of it. Or we're just like, it's like being too open-minded to where you believe anything. Like, you don't want to be so open-minded that anyone can put any thought in your head and you just believe them,
Yeah. You need to fact
right?
check
And so Gemini is
too.
open-minded, and Jupiter's expanding that, which means it's like, oh, open your mind
Oh,
bigger.
no.
But yeah, you open your mind too big, your brain falls out, and then everyone just shoves a bunch of garbage in your head.
Oh, no. That can get you into trouble.
And that can get you into trouble. So we don't want to become so open-minded that we are losing touch with reality, or believing anything without having good reason to believe it. So I think we still have to watch out for misinformation. We have to be willing to question who this information is coming from. Is it true? Again, with the AI, like we're going into this whole thing where like it used to be, at least if I saw something on video, I could believe it for the most part. Like, but now not so much because AI can do these crazy things that it's really hard to tell the difference between what's
It's
real and what's
hard
not.
to tell the difference. You're right. I have
Yeah.
I have people on my friends like falling for like AI pic my friends list falling for AI pictures and it's like really sad. Some of them are
Mm-hmm.
harmless, but some of them can be pretty damaging.
Right. And again, we're going into an election year and there's all kinds of like very intense political things happening. We don't know necessarily what's true or what's real anymore. So I think that's part of this Jupiter and Gemini experience is going to be this intensity or this expansion of like the Gemini energy of like, I don't know if this is true or not. The Gemini that's like asking the questions and getting curious. We're all going to have to be super curious and we cannot just believe things on sight
Yeah.
as much as that's like upsetting. So so we'll have to reevaluate what we what kind of media we take in, what kind of things we see as truth, how we come to conclusions about things.
Yeah.
And then through that process, we have to also recognize that on a spiritual level, Jupiter in Gemini is maybe encouraging like a broad-minded approach to our faith and opening us up to new faith and new belief systems and new like philosophies and theological concepts. Um,
Yeah.
but then on the reverse side of that, like we can also get swept up in intellectual arrogance or dogmatism. Like Jupiter is really confident.
Oh,
So
yeah.
Jupiter gets involved and it's like, nope, I know that what I believe is the absolute truth because you just have that confidence, right? And that confidence could potentially be misled or arrogant or like believing in some dogmatic thing that needs to change in some way because Jupiter wants us to be mutable. It wants us to be flexible.
Yeah.
And Jupiter has a tendency of getting very stuck in a belief system as the planet of like beliefs.
Yeah.
And so that's another conflict of Jupiter in Gemini is we want to feel confident in what we believe in. Whether it's a spiritual belief or an
Um,
intellectual belief, we want to feel confident. We don't like feeling like, well, I don't know what the truth is. I don't know what I believe. That's not a comfortable feeling.
it's not.
And but Gemini's like question everything, believe nothing.
Yeah.
Gemini wants to play the devil's advocate and say, but why?
But
Gemini's
why?
that kid in Sunday school that's asking why all the time. And like the teacher gets really frustrated because they're like, we'll just have faith, just believe. And Gemini's like, no, I'm not going to just believe because you tell me to. I want to know why, you
Yeah.
know? And so
It's
Jupiter gets here and Jupiter's like big boss daddy religion on beliefs. Like,
big
and
possibly.
Gemini's like, well, why? Why do you
But
want me to believe
why?
that? And so we have to like be willing to like question our own beliefs, and
Hmm.
that can get really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So we want to, because we want to feel right,
We do.
but we want to be willing to allow more information in to that
Hmm.
might change our worldview, and that's
Yeah.
difficult to navigate.
Yeah, it
So
can be.
so yeah, like that's why like now that we've kind of broken down this Jupiter and Gemini information, now the Eight of Swords makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does actually. It's like the planet's in detriment, the card's in detriment, but really that detriment is kind of like in the mind. You're not as stuck as you think
Yeah,
you are.
right, because this is all about like questioning what you believe to be true, um, and recognizing that like, okay, you feel overwhelmed because you have information overload. There's a solution to that, is I just need to focus on one thing at a time and I need to prioritize what I'm worrying about,
Yeah.
right? And so I can't take care of all these swords at once. I only need one of these swords to help me get free from being tied up in these bonds that are on the Eight of Swords. And if I'm
Yeah.
overthinking which sword to like rub myself on to untie the ropes, then I'm never going to do it, right? So there's that decision paralysis and that uncertainty. That uncertainty. So the Eight of Wands keywords and concepts: blindness, uncertainty, decision paralysis, fear, helplessness,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
isolation or feeling alone. You might not actually be alone, but you feel alone. Information
Yeah.
overload, limitation, restriction, mental entrapment, negative thinking, self-imposed barriers, being trapped, feeling stuck, and having a victim mentality. All of
Yeah.
those things are states of mind.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. Jupiter is in detriment in Gemini, but it doesn't have to be a malefic thing. Like you have to take power, take control of your mind enough to
Yeah.
recognize that like these are all states of mind and you can overcome them by with a shift in perspective, with believing in yourself. Um, so there's that feeling of decision paralysis or fatigue. We have too many options. And so we
Yeah.
may need to just simplify or narrow down our choices. It's like my partner will come to me, he's a Jupiter and Gemini person, and he says, "What do you
Mm-hmm.
want for dinner?" And I go,
Oh
"I don't
no.
know. Like, give me some option." Like, and I tell him, like, you have to give me some choices. And once he says, "Oh, well, we can have chicken, or we can have hamburgers, or we can have pasta." And then I can go, "Okay, now I can decide what to have for dinner." But when you just say, "What do you want for dinner?" I can't decide because I don't know what my options are. Um, and so another thing is like decision fatigue can happen when you are responsible for making all these big choices in your day-to-day life. You have to get up
Yeah.
and you have to decide what to feed the baby, what to wear to go to work, and then you go to work and you have to decide what route to take to drive there. And you make all these decisions while you're at work that are possibly very big decisions. And then you get home and then your partner's like, "What do you want for
What do you
dinner?"
want for dinner? Like,
And it's like you've been making decisions all day long, and eventually you get to a point where your brain is just fatigued. You need a break. You need to
yeah.
not have to decide. You need someone else to say, "Hey, we're going to have this for dinner." Or to
Yeah.
narrow
Like,
down your
take
choices
the
to some
wheel.
very simple options, like, what do you want to watch on TV tonight? Or like, hey, do you want to watch um Bob's Burgers or do you want to watch a movie? Like, give me some simplified options here. And so we can
Yeah.
try to help ourselves avoid this decision fatigue, I think, by advocating for ourselves with our friends and our partners. Like, I'm exhausted. I don't want to make a choice right now. You decide.
Yeah.
Or like asking them to help us narrow things down so we don't have as many choices to make, so that we don't
Yeah.
feel so overwhelmed and like we constantly have to be making all of these choices. And then we can choose how to deal with the information overload also and the information fatigue. And that's when we're constantly receiving this new information and we don't have time to like fully process or examine the information that we receive before we're already like on to the next thing, receiving more information. So we can choose to not engage with that. We can say, like, at this time of day, I'm not going to be on social media for these 3 hours every day, or I'm not going to, um,
Or
instead
watch
of
the
like
news.
listening to the news or podcasts, we can go, I'm going to, on this day, just listen to some relaxing music and take a walk. Like we can choose to like step back and let our minds process
Mm-hmm.
all of the information that we've been dumping into them all day. And
Yeah.
having a meditation practice, I think, is going to be really good for during Jupiter and Gemini. Just kind of just sit and breathe and be quiet, right? It's so
That's
hard.
hard for Gemini to do.
It's so hard, but I think it could be the difference between like making it and having a mental breakdown.
Yeah.
Honestly, during this Jupiter and Gemini transit, like having a practice of just like, all right, it's annoying as hell, I hate it, but I'm gonna just sit here and breathe for 5 minutes without listening to anything else, without reading something, without doing something, just be here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we need to Oh, okay. I remember now. There was this other thing that I wanted to talk about. I know it's getting towards the end. We won't take too much more time.
Okay.
But when we start talking about like spirituality and beliefs, Jupiter is definitely like, what does it mean? Is this a sign? Is that an omen? Because Jupiter, it's kind of like how we talk to God, or whatever we feel the divine is, whether it's the universe or nature or whatever, the thing that's bigger than us that talks to us through the universe and our intuition is kind of like this very Jupiter experience, right?
Yeah.
So we know, like, I know that as tarot readers, we definitely believe in like symbolism and that things can have meaning, and there's some kind of force that, like, when I shuffle my cards and draw a card, and it brings me a message that is somehow meant for me, right? And whether you believe that that works by like coincidence, or it's spicy psychology, or no matter what you
Spicy
believe about that, we all
psychology.
kind of interact with this concept of like being given some information from the universe that is a kind of communication between us and like something bigger than us, right?
Yeah.
And that's very Jupiter, and it's also very Gemini, because Gemini is about communication, and Jupiter is taking our communication and making it bigger. So we're not just communicating with people, we're communicating with the universe or the divine
We're
or nature or God
magnifying and making
or
everything
something. So,
grander.
right. So I think that there's a really big opportunity for Jupiter and Gemini to help us like grow our intuition and grow our practice of seeing signs and omens in things around us. Um,
Yeah.
but also there's the bad side of that, or the like not great
Don't
part
let
of
it
that
dip into
concept.
paranoia.
Right, is because you can start being like everything is meaning something, and you can start thinking that every little thing that happens to you has a meaning, is an omen. There's a moth in my bedroom. What does it mean? It just means you left the window open and a moth got in. Or does it actually mean something? Is there a spiritual message from moth for you? So we have to practice a lot of discernment
Yeah.
to be able to know whether the things we're seeing are relevant to us in this moment or not. Because it's
Hmm.
very easy to get wrapped up in like I believe that the universe can communicate with me. And so I do believe that sometimes when I see a certain bird outside, it might be a message for me in some way. In some way that might have meaning. But I also live in an area where I have birds in my yard every day, like all the time. And so I don't want to get caught up in like a paranoia or a delusions of grandeur where like I think that everything means something. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I think that that's part of this here, this card, the Eight of Swords. When I'm looking at it, I'm like, um, on one hand, she's blindfolded and she's tied up. So this person in the card is going to have to trust in faith and intuition in order to get out of the situation,
Yeah.
right? There is a certain element of I'm tied up, I'm blindfolded, I'm going to have to get some kind of sign or communication from God to tell me what to do next, right? Like
Yeah.
God or the universe or the divine, like something's going to have to spark my intuition to tell me that if I take two steps backward very carefully, I can find a blade and untie myself. But if I take two steps forward, instead I'm getting farther away from the blades. There has to be some kind of intuition happening here. But
Mm.
we also have to be able to discern which thing in our head that we're hearing is our intuition versus what's our anxiety.
Yeah.
Like, what's actually the voice of the universe versus what's me telling me that I'm in a hopeless situation and I'm a victim and I'm never going to get out of this type of thing. Or like delusions of grandeur, if I just run as fast as I can, I'll be fine, but there might be a cliff in front of me and I don't want to run straight ahead.
So, like, the Eight of Swords is like when everything becomes a sign and then you're stuck because of it.
Right, because if everything's a sign, then nothing's a sign, because if everything has meaning, then nothing has meaning.
Yeah.
And like that sounds preposterous, but it's also kind of like this Jupiter expanding things
Yeah.
to the point that like hyper meaningfulness, like things become so meaningful that they lose meaning. And like overthinking all of the details of everything. Have you ever like looked at a word and read like you write a word so many times that suddenly it seems like that can't possibly be what that word, how that word is spelled, or what that word means?
Yeah.
It just suddenly like it becomes like it sounds and looks like gobbledygook after a while. Because
Is
it's like you
laughter really spelled
overanalyzed
that
it or
way?
overlooked at it to the point that it lost meaning, and you're like, that can't possibly be the word that I mean, and that can't possibly be spelled right. But it
Yeah.
is, but it doesn't make sense anymore. And I think
No.
that's the realm that we run danger of like running into with Jupiter in Gemini.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so I wanted to just really quickly cover a couple of things, like what do you think is a positive from Jupiter in Gemini?
I like that
We can
Jupiter.
easily see the negatives with the Eight of Swords and
Yeah.
Jupiter in detriment. I just want to end with like, let's talk about some of the upsides.
Yeah, so Jupiter in Gemini takes curiosity and makes like I think it's like curiosity overdrive, but that can be a good thing in some cases. Like some people just aren't curious enough, and curiosity can be
Mhm.
infectious. And I think Jupiter in Gemini gives that Gemini mercurial energy like an infectious curiosity, if that
Yes,
makes sense.
I
Yeah.
think that it can really expand and open us up to better problem solving
Yeah, like
and like
meaningful.
more mental clarity, more meaningful communication.
Yeah, you're not doing it just to do it. You're doing it for a reason, for a purpose. It's more purposeful.
Yeah, I think that we can really go beyond the talking just to be heard, but talking because we really have something important to communicate, and
Hmm.
listening deeper too, because we recognize that someone else has something really important to share, so we can listen more deeply instead of just waiting for like our turn to talk.
Hmm.
I think that we could possibly experience a a lot of expanding our social circles, because Gemini is so social and very much about like the friendships that we make,
Yeah.
and Jupiter's expanding that. So blessing our social gatherings and expanding our social circles to like help us make new friends and branch out and meet new people.
Yeah. And I think Jupiter and
And
Gemini.
recognize our similarities, because Gemini is really good at recognizing what you have in common with everyone around you.
Yeah. I was gonna say Jupiter and
And
Gemini would be a good season for innovation. Like
oh yeah,
I feel like it's a very innovative. transit.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely like that curiosity that makes you ask more questions, and how things work leads to these light bulb moments of like, oh, here's the solution. Let's create this. Let's invent this. Let's improve this technology or this product. And yeah, it leads to a lot of innovation.
Yeah.
I think that there is a potential for discovering our inner strength when we look at the
Yeah.
Eight of Swords and we see the restriction and the and then we recognize that that restriction is caused by our own thoughts or our own beliefs. And therefore we recognize that like the solution is also within our own mind and our own beliefs. And this is very empowering. And so
Yeah.
we recognize our own inner strength and the strength of our mind, the strength of our ideas and our thoughts, the resilience of our mind to get through hard things, and the ability to like confront our fears and our negative thoughts. Like that moment of like, I can't let my fears hold me back anymore. I just have to like be afraid and do it anyway.
Do it anyway. When I'm reading the Eight of
Yes.
Swords for someone else and I'm trying to put a positive spin on it, I usually say something like this. You have the Eight of Swords and you can feel very restricted and limiting, but if you notice that it's the swords is a suit of air, and it rules your thoughts, and once you realize it's your thoughts that are holding you back, you can truly see that you're actually boundless and limitless in your
Hmm.
potential. And that's like very Jupiter energy right there.
Absolutely. And I love that, yeah, that's a really good way of putting a positive spin on receiving this card in a reading. Is like, yeah, it may feel hopeless, but it's not actually hopeless, because this is a state of mind and you do have the ability to solve this problem and recognize that you're not actually as trapped or as helpless as you think that you are in this
Absolutely.
situation.
Yeah.
And so that's a
It's not
good
like the
thing to
devil.
remember. That's a really good thing to remember throughout this whole year as we go forward with Jupiter and Gemini, is just like, it's not as bad as we think it is, or there's always a solution or a way to reframe how we're thinking about things so that we can recognize that we're not as trapped as we might feel.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
there's a solution. We can't solve all of the world's problems, obviously, but we can narrow it down to try to solve one or two of our own problems,
yeah.
at least, and not just be so helpless that we're like giving up and throwing up our hands and just being like, I can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I
Yeah, of
am really
course.
grateful for just having another voice here on my channel for Gemini season to talk about Gemini stuff and to talk about Jupiter in Gemini.
Jupiter
And
and Gemini realness.
yes, Jupiter and Gemini realness, it's gonna get really, really real. Or really, really hyper real. And then really unreal, because like we get that, too much meaning and it just becomes meaningless. So
It's like at first your mind expands, but then it's like, wait a minute, what is going on?
right. And I think that might be the point we're at with this episode, is we've talked too much and now it doesn't mean anything anymore. So I think this is
Well,
a good stopping point.
thank
Do
you,
you have
Liliana, for having
a
me on here. Oh, go ahead.
yeah,